Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Vas Christodoulou, the How To Academy's Deputy Director and the producer of our weekly podcast series. Tonight's guest, William Dalrymple, was born in Scotland and now lives on a farm outside Delhi. He's the author of In Xanadu, The Last Mughal, and 9 Lives, among many other best-selling works, and the winner of the Wolfson Prize for History, the Scottish Book of the Year Prize, and the Duff Cooper Memorial Prize. He's here tonight to tell us the story of the East India Company. Please welcome William Dalrymple.
Thank you very much for that. Could we go to the first slide and load straight in? We should be seeing a wonderful picture of Powis Castle. Slide after that. Here we go. So you may be wondering why, when you've just signed up to a talk about India, that we start instead in this gorgeous crenellated castle on the Anglo-Welsh marches. This is Powis Castle, and you'd be right to be surprised in a sense in that this is, as you can see, is the epitome of Britishness. Wonderful Tudor box hedges rising to a Renaissance doorway, and these wonderful craggy medieval crenellations. But step inside Powis Castle and you see something quite different. We have the next slide. Because inside Powis lies more Mughal loot than you'll find in any museum in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or Afghanistan. Powis is full of room after room of elephant armor, swords, shields, ivory chess players, the dresses of Mughal Nawabs, gorgeous miniatures, and one or two really quite major pieces of international importance. Next slide. We are looking here through the palanquin of Nawab Siraj ud-Dowlah, who was famously defeated by Clive, Robert Clive, later known as Lord Clive or Clive of India, on the battlefields of Plassey. And this is Siraj's palanquin, a rather fancy litter on which he was carried into the battle, but which he never rode away from the battle because he had to jump on his horse and flee for his life. And this was taken as loot after the Battle of Plassey. Loot, of course, being a Hindustani word. Lutna is the verb to plunder in Hindustani, and still a word in use in Urdu and Hindi. And it enters the English language at this period for the very good reason that great quantities of loot were being carried back from India to Britain by the East India Company. If you go through the arch at the end of this slide, incidentally, you end up in another spectacular set of plunder gathered in India. In the case of the next room, it's Tipu Sultan, who was defeated by the East India Company in 1799, whose capital was raped, looted, and pillaged, and many of the nicest things found their way back to Powis again. So you get the impression, Powis filled with goodies. And how did it get there? Well, that question is answered by the picture over the doorway leading into this khazana, this treasure house. Next slide. It's not a very good picture. It's by Benjamin West, and the caption says, Shah Alam conveying the gift of the Diwani to Lord Clive. I actually held the Diwani in my hand this morning for the very first time. I went to the British Library and asked to get it out. And it's a simple document written in Persian on one side, in English on the other, with the stamps of Shah Alam and the stamps of Lord Clive. And these are the people depicted in this later painting by Benjamin West. Shah Alam is the slightly bent-backed Mughal emperor, handing a document over to Lord Clive, who's the slightly portly figure in scarlet redcoat, and behind him stands the next signature underneath Clive on the Diwani document, which is that of Archibald Swinton, who incidentally is Tilda Swinton, the actress's immediate forebear and the source of the the Swinton fortune in India. In the course of the same campaign, he actually lost his right hand fighting the Mughals, and famously had a cork hand for the rest of his life. Anyway, the importance of this document was that it handed over to a private company the three richest provinces in the Mughal Empire at a time when the Mughal Empire controlled about 40% of the world's trade. And England, this is obviously before the Act of Union, sorry, it isn't before the Act of Union, this was just after that, but England and the United Kingdom then controlled about 1.7% of the world's trade. So this bizarre piece of history whereby one private company in one office in the City of London in Leadenhall Street manages through military means, through subterfuge and through trickery, which we'll hear about later, and through bribery and corruption to defeat the armies of the richest empire in the world, and to begin the process of asset stripping and plundering and looting that country to the enormous disadvantage of India, but to the great enrichment of Great Britain. And when you see one of these gorgeous treasure houses like Powis, often now in the hands of the National Trust, dotted around the country, if they were built with new money in the late 18th century, the chances are that the money came either from the East India Company, from the looting of India, or from the Caribbean slave trade. And this is something in a sense that we really have to face up to. We think of these buildings as these gorgeous sort of Jane Austen-y excrescences in our landscape, and they look as if Colin Firth might sort of dive out of any portal and sort of plunge into a lake to the light of assembled Jane Austen-y ladies and bonnets. But often the stories that these estates hide is a very dark one. And one that we British tend to be very good at forgetting the source of the wealth which produced these buildings. But the key point here seems, I think, to emphasize is that it was not the British government to which Shah Alam is handing over the document. Although Clive did indeed have a commission from the Crown to be an extraordinary colonel while in India, he was nonetheless not an employee of the Crown. He was an employee of the East India Company. And the East India Company was a corporation. It was no more the government of Great Britain than Jeff Bezos of Amazon, or Facebook or Google or Exxon Mobil or any of these other giant American corporations are the American government. You might have relations with the American government. They might even be able to lobby and alter the policies of the American government, but they are not the American government. They are corporations. And this is true of the company too. Next slide. At the time of Plassey, this is the headquarters of the East India Company. It's not even the two buildings on either side, the tall buildings, it's just the small one in the middle, 5 windows wide. A century into the existence of the East India Company, there are only, I think, 35 employees here in Leadenhall Street in the head office. So it's an incredibly lean operation. And how does the company pull off the trick of conquering India? Very simple. They realize that Indian bankers are speaking the same sort of language as they are. The bankers of India are money men. They are corporates of a different stripe. And they know that the company, even though it might loot, plunder, loot, and do all the rest of this, it will repay loans on time with interest, that they understand the importance of financial solvency, financial responsibility, and they are therefore the natural allies of the Indian banking class. So the East India Company realizes very quickly that it can borrow money from the Mawari bankers of Calcutta and use that money to train up an Indian army, because it's not white British troops that conquer India in the 18th century. It is brown Indians from Bihar, from Telangana, from UP. And there is just a small officer class, maybe 5% of the army, who oversee the training and the discipline of these troops. But overwhelmingly, India, the company pulls off the trick of conquering India with a mercenary army of Indians to fight other Indians, paid for by Indian money, borrowed from Indian bankers, which is why as few as 250 clerks pull off the trick of governing Bengal in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Plassey. It's an extraordinary story. It's the story really of the greatest corporate takeover in world history, and certainly the most ruthless corporate behavior in world history. Next slide. So the company is a corporation, a joint stock company, and it has a founder, this man, Sir Thomas Smythe, who is the sort of Richard Branson, if you like, of Elizabethan England. An entrepreneur, he makes his first fortune in his 20s importing currants from the Greek islands. He then founds the Levant Company with some fellow magnates. They all invest a small amount together. And he's making good money from the Levant Company when very bad news comes from Holland, that the Dutch have begun sailing round the Cape of Good Hope and getting spices directly from the Moluccas, from Indonesia. Therefore, Smythe's Levant Company, which buys its spices from Aleppo and Cairo and Venice, is producing old spices at much more expensive rates with cuts to the middlemen, rather than the Dutch who are buying direct from the producers and can sell much cheaper, much fresher spices. So Smythe realizes that the only option for it is to found his own East India Company, which he does. And he calls a public meeting, next slide, in the Founders Hall in Moorgate Fields on the 22nd of September, 1599, which, to give you an idea, is around the time that Shakespeare is writing Hamlet. And here in this image, we have the names of all the people that turned up at the meeting, starting with the Lord Mayor of London at the top, who contributes £200. Then the next guy, whose name I can't read, it's too small on my screen, but I can see that he contributes £1,000. Then the next one gives 200. And so on and so forth, down several pages until by the end, you've got not the grandees of the City of London, but you've got small guys who describe themselves as haberdashers, as grocers, as vintners, as skinners. In other words, small London businessmen, and they're giving £10, £5. They're giving all their savings to this new venture in the hope of making a fortune. So having gathered some capital, Smythe then appoints a commander of the first company expedition. Next slide. And that is this guy, Sir James Lancaster. Not an obvious choice, because Sir James Lancaster has screwed up the last voyage to attempt to get to the Moluccas and sunk all the ships, and indeed lost most of his crew to cannibals. It's only when Lancaster manages to make it back by hitching a lift on another boat that he makes it back to London. Nonetheless, he had been to the Moluccas, which no one else in England had. So he is given the job, and they go off together, Sir Thomas Smythe and Sir James Lancaster, and they go to Deptford and they buy a ship. They reject a creaky old hulk called the Mayflower, which is sitting there, which obviously a little later in its career makes another voyage, not east but west. But the ship they choose on this day is a little pirate ship called, and I'm not making this up, the Scourge of Malice. It sounds like Jack Sparrow's flagship from Pirates of the Caribbean, but it's not. It's a real ship. It was a pirate ship, a privateer, and now it's the property of the company, who quite promptly rename it the Red Dragon, presumably because they didn't want to sound like they were Jack Sparrow. And off they sail. It hasn't had a very promising start. Lancaster's ships get becalmed off the coast of Dover. Lots of people come and wave and mock these guys for being unable to get beyond the White Cliffs. But the winds pick up, they sail off, they do make it around the coast, they even make it to Indonesia. Just as they're coming into port, they spot a Portuguese ship coming out full of spices. So what do? As most of the crew are ex-pirates, they simply board the Portuguese carrack, move the spices from the hold of the Portuguese ship into their own, and they sail home to London, where they sell the spices for £1 million, thereby enriching everybody who had invested in the expedition. So the East India Company is founded, but it doesn't go as planned, because the Dutch are always one step ahead. They have better ships, better captains than Lancaster, deeper pockets, better financial instruments, and also a better navy. And by the 1640s, the East India Company ships are being successfully kept away from the Moluccas by the Dutch Navy. There's a whole lot of engagements, which the East India Company is worsened by. And eventually a treaty is signed, basically handing over the Moluccas to the Dutch. And in return, as a faith saver, the British are given instead a muddy island in the Hudson River. Its name is Manhattan, which obviously in the long run is rather a good investment. But the East India Company has to make a decision, and rather like a startup today, which has slightly lost its mojo after the first few years, they have a sort of reorientation of the business, a relaunch in the 1640s. And this time, they decide to trade not with Indonesia and the Moluccas and spices, but to trade in textiles. And the main source of the highest quality textiles in the 1640s was Mughal India. So a full 40 years after the company is founded, it finally focuses not on the Indies, in other words, what we today would call Indonesia, but on India. And they send off expeditions to Surat, the big Mughal port, and very soon they find they're onto a good thing, because Mughal India is at the peak of its aesthetic brilliance. This is the same sort of period that the Taj Mahal is being built by Shah Jahan, that Mughal miniatures are being painted, that the gorgeous palaces of Delhi and Agra are being erected. And this same aesthetic that informs their buildings and their art informs their textiles. So the East India Company gets a sort of semi-monopoly on trading these textiles through different parts of Europe and also to the New World. By the end of the century, by 1700, such is the quantity of simple white Bengali cotton that the company is shipping around the world that there is deindustrialization in Mexico from the sheer quantity of cheap Indian cottons being imported by the company. So the company rises to power effectively as turning themselves into the shippers of the Mughals. The Mughals we tend to think of as these sort of luxurious Muslim lords bestraddled some Bollywood set, dropping mangoes into the mouths of concubines. But actually, one would do much better to think of them as very go-ahead industrialists, because it is the textile trade under the Mughals which gives India 40% of world GDP, which is a massive slice of world trade at a time when the Brits are now, at the time of the foundation of the company, I think it was 1.7% coming out of England. By the time of the end of the 18th century, by the end of the 17th century, the East India Company, England has about 7% of world GDP, but India, with 40%, is way ahead. And the East India Company, on the back of this, builds a new headquarters. Next slide. In Leadenhall Street, this thing looks like a nice sort of Jacobean pub or the Globe Theatre, all wood with nice glass arcade, a balcony, pictures of ships at the top. This is 1711. Next slide. They build a dock at Deptford where they make ships. By the end of the 17th century, they have a very go-ahead fleet of East Indiamen. Next slide. And all goes well until the Mughal Empire begins to totter. And it does this under this guy, the Emperor Aurangzeb.